Welcome, welcome. Welcome to Key Money Deals, how to buy and sell restaurants and bars. The reason why we decided to do this particular webinar is because so many of our clients are buying and selling restaurants now that Raluca, who works with us and who kind of heads that department and who was supposed to do this with me, couldn't be here today because she's too damn busy. She's so busy doing buying and selling and closing deals that she said, I don't got time for this, Helbraun. So Helbraun's doing it himself. It's my first solo show. I'm going solo. I knew I'd have a chance at some point in my career. I'm the Harry Styles of restaurant webinars. That's pretty niche, huh, Alex? Anyway, let's talk about key money deals and why they're important. Alex, you can go to the next slide, please. Well, first, there's a legal disclaimer. The attorneys I work with always make me put this in. It just says, we're not giving you legal advice. And if you want advice for what you're doing, just give us a call. That's it. That's the legal disclaimer. Let's get into buying and selling in the jargon. If you're going to consider buying or selling your restaurant, you got to understand the language. The whole reason that we do these webinars in the first place is to educate our clients. It is our fervent belief that the more educated our clients are, the better off they're going to be in this rough and tumble hospitality world. We want to teach you as much as we possibly can, so you're walking around this world and you're interacting in this world and you know what's going on. The more you know, the better. There used to be this company called the Burlington Coat Factory, and they used to have commercials in New York that would say, an educated consumer is our best customer, something like that, but I feel the same way. So first, let's talk about buying and selling, and welcome everybody who just came in. If you have questions along the way, just hit me up in the chat. After each slide, I'll take a look at your questions and decide which ones I want to answer. And at the end, we're going to have a lot of time for Q&A. So let's talk about the vernacular of buying and selling. First thing we have to know is key money. Why the hell is it called a key money deal? Where did that even come from? Nobody actually knows. I've always said, if you give me some money, I'll give you the keys to my business, key money. And that's how I've always explained it to myself and to my clients. Other people think it comes from the fact that if I pay you some money, I'm getting a turnkey business. We all know that's not really true. Nobody pays money to just take a key, open it up, and start their own business. If you do, you're doing something wrong. So these are called key money deals. And when you're looking to open up a new restaurant, you have a choice. You can look for a key money deal, or you can look to another space that was a retail space before, a brand new space, whatever it is, not a key money deal. Key money means you're buying a restaurant or bar that's going out of business. The next term you have to know is LOI and term sheet. These are interchangeable. Letter of intent and term sheet. They're the same. The important thing to know about them is that they're not binding. They're not binding. It's going to say on the term sheet, this is not binding. It's an intention. However, if you're a restaurant person in this industry, in this city, you know that everybody knows everybody. And the last thing that you want to do is sign a term sheet and then change your mind, meaning change your mind on the terms, meaning add a term that wasn't there before. It's called retrading, another term that you should know. Retrading means that you've agreed to something and then you've decided better of it. You've had time to negotiate and now you've retraded. Landlords hate it. Sellers hate it, buyers hate it, and you will get a bad reputation if you do it. So don't retrade. Good. Next term, APA. That's what we call it in-house. That's what lawyers call it. Maybe you should know what that means too. That's an asset purchase agreement. You're buying assets of a business, you're selling assets of a business, whatever you want to call it, we call it an APA. It's jargon, it's industry jargon. So understand it. If you call it an APA, people will know what you're talking about. A big part of the deal is lease assignments. It's a huge part of the deal. Whoever's buying your business, or if you're buying one, you're going to be taking over this lease or selling this lease. The act of selling a lease with the landlord is called an assignment of the lease. You're taking the lease and you're assigning it from you to somebody else. A lease assignment. Here you go. I got a buyer. Great. You can take over my lease. It's never that easy. Forget it. Don't think it's that easy. It's not. Because there's a lot of things that are going to come up and we're going to talk about a lease assignment. I just want you to understand what the term means. You're going to want to change some terms. That's a modification. So now we're starting to add to it. You have a lease assignment. Yay, I want to give the lease to this person. Okay. And then the other person says, well, I don't want the lease the way it is. I need to modify it. Oh, really? What do you want to modify? Well, I want not 3 years left that you have, but I want 10. Oh, that's an extension. Okay, so you want to modify it by extending it. That's cool. What else? Well, I don't like all these other clauses in it, so I want to change those. So now you're asking the landlord to both modify, extend, and assign. So you got to understand what that all means. Escrow deposit. An escrow account is a lawyer account. When we're talking about these deals, where you take some of your money and you put it in there for safekeeping. Typically, an escrow deposit is 10% of the purchase price. You're going to sell a place for $200,000. $20,000 goes into escrow when you sign the APA. That goes into escrow in case somebody misbehaves. Let's just say somebody breaches the contract. That deposit might go to the other side. Escrow deposit. Due diligence. Once we have a LOI signed or a term sheet signed, well, especially if you're a buyer, you have to do some due diligence. You have to do a tax and lien search. Who owns this equipment? You have to make sure that there's not sales tax owed. And there's a whole list of things that we're going to talk about. But the due diligence period is important. Oftentimes, that is when you will see adjustments happening to the purchase price. Yeah, I'm doing some due diligence. I'm checking out your equipment. I'm checking out this. Oh, it turns out you don't actually own that piece of equipment. Fine. I'm not paying you $200,000. I'm going to pay $180,000. Happens all the time. Due diligence. Bulk sales notice is a notice that we send in, the attorneys that is, we send in to the New York State Sales Tax Department. Yay, everybody's favorite agency. Why are we sending them a bulk sales notice? Because they need to sign off on the deal. If you're selling your restaurant, you need to notify them. You need to show them a sale agreement that shows how much you're selling it for. They do a little research. They go onto their computers. They put on their green visor. They hit their little buttons and they say, oh, well, looks like the seller owes us 50 grand in past sales tax. We need you to hold that money and we need to be paid that at closing. And if you don't do it and you're the buyer, you can be liable for that sales tax. That's insane. We've seen it happen and it's awful. Got to send in a bulk sales notice. Okay. That's the jargon. Let's get into some of the other stuff, whether or not you want to buy. Deciding to buy is a big deal. You're ready to open up a second place or a first place. We have some clients who only do key money deals. They don't want the hassle of all the stuff that happens with building out a new space. So if you decide to buy and you think that's a good idea for you, the first thing you need to do is contact a broker. Call a broker who has a history of buying and selling restaurants. These guys are tapped in. It's not the best business for brokers. A lot of work goes into it. The payoff's not that great, but there are guys who do it because they understand that it can be a loss leader for them, in that they're making their inroads into the hospitality industry, and they'll do the deals because they want the client for future deals. So call your broker. We know some of them. If they do key money deals, there's a handful of them. Give them a call and then investigate the inventory. The first thing I always ask a broker is what's moving? What's the market like? We, during COVID, went through a massive seller's market, obviously. My clients who were aggressive in that first year of COVID were snatching things up for peanuts. And we were advising them to do it. We knew it would end at some point. And not saying it's over, but things have leveled out. So we had a lot of clients out there who were running around buying restaurants for, $20,000, $30,000 where they might have been $150,000, $200,000. So understand the market. Right now, the market is still probably a buyer's market. There's a lot of people who have settled down and become comfortable with the notion that their lower performing restaurants might need to be let go. And so we have a lot of people buying them, but we also have a lot of people selling. There is some inventory out there. You have to ask around. It's not just the broker you should call, though. You might want to ask around quietly. See if they have some pocket listings, meaning a broker's got something that they know is coming on the market, but it's not listed yet. And a broker who has a deep inventory of clients may have these pocket listings. Then go visit some spaces. You got to educate yourself. You have to see what's out there on the market. So when you find a good deal, you know it. It's the same thing about being a New Yorker in apartments. You only know the apartment that you want to ultimately rent or buy after you look at 100 other ones. It's the same thing with restaurants. Unless, of course, you know the space and you've been hanging out there for years. But go visit some spaces. When you find one that you like, the very first thing to do is get your GC in there. Looks great, looks beautiful. You can't open the walls, but your GC can go in there and they can inspect the HVAC system. They can inspect the plumbing system, the electric, the boiler, the Ansel system, the stack to the roof. These are the big ticket items. The HVAC is the biggest one. Make sure that shit works. It's got to work. You do not want to get into a situation where you pay $150,000 in key money and then have to spend another $50,000 or $100,000 to fix your HVAC. So get your GC in there. That's when you start to negotiate the price. Let your GC tell you what needs to be done. Let your GC give you some kind of an estimate as to how much it's going to cost to build out the space according to your specs. Then, once you've got all that information, determine what you think it's going to cost to renovate it. And be a realist and understand that whatever you think it's going to cost more. And it's going to cost anywhere from 15 to 50 to 100% more. It depends on how good your GC is and how sharp you are, but it's going to cost you more. Okay? So those are the things that go into deciding whether or not to buy a place. Let's move on to the next slide and why we buy and some of the pros of buying. The biggest pro is that it's less expensive than a full build out. Always, you're buying the bones. You're buying the permitting. These are things that cost money. Time costs money and build out costs money. So if you're buying the MEP, the mechanical, the electric, the plumbing, you're buying the HVAC that works. You're buying the fact that the kitchen is pitched the right way and that your drains are set up correctly. You're buying the fact that you have enough amperage in the space to do what you want to do. You're buying the fact that you're not going to have to go to DOB that much. Also, of course, there's the liquor license, because when you buy a place, one of the things you're paying for is the ability to transfer a liquor license. It's called a transfer. It's not a transfer. What happens with a transfer is, because there is a license there, you can file for a temporary permit. And you can get that temporary permit in a much shorter period of time than having to wait when you start from scratch. The theory from the State Liquor Authority is that, well, this place has been licensed before, so there shouldn't be too many issues with the community board. We're going to give you a temporary that you can renew until we look at your application. Once we look at your application and it's good, we'll give you your permanent license. If you're going to be in Manhattan or Brooklyn, you know that the community boards are our best friends. We love the community boards. We love them so much that we don't want to get into any kind of problems with them. The community board can absolutely hang up anything you're doing. They can make you stipulate as to what hours you have to close, how much you can use the outside, how much you charge for a goddamn hamburger. I mean, we've seen it all. So we want to slide by that community board as easily as we can. Community boards understand that the State Liquor Authority is almost always going to say yes to a transfer application. So they don't really fight that hard unless there's been a bad history there. So when you buy a place, you still have to go in front of them. You still have to kiss their ass and say what you're going to do, and you're going to be great and all these things, but they're not going to give you a hard time. And if they give you a hard time, it's a 2 on a scale of 1 to 10, when they usually give you a 10. So that's important. Also, and this affects your bottom line, is there are a lot fewer delays to getting open. You go in, you make the deal, you close it down, you rebrand, you change the awning, put some lights in the window. Maybe you don't like the furniture, you order some new furniture. Maybe the kitchen's not exactly how you want it. You do a couple of things, you hire the PR firm. Boom, you're rebranding, you're advertising, got everything in place. You're open in 2 or 3 months. Not bad. It's fast. When you're starting from scratch, it could be way longer than that. It could be 6 months. It could be a year before you're open. And guess what? You're going to be paying rent for some of that time. So the faster you get open, the better start you get off to, the more likely you are to actually be successful. The last thing you want to do is get hung up with DOB, because they have to inspect, and then they come, and then they find something wrong, and then they come back. Fire department's going to come and check your ANSO system and check all of the stuff in your basement and everywhere. They might not like what they see. They might come back. DOH is going to come anyway. Con Ed also, big issue. So with Con Ed, 2 things can happen. We've seen major delays in 2 different areas. One is with a new build out, if you need something from the street, you need power, you got to clear it with Con Ed. They got to come, they got to build, they got to do, they take forever. The other thing we see with Con Ed is that if the previous owner owes some money, sometimes they are very slow to get you up and running. So it's important when we talk about the due diligence period to make sure that Con Ed is dealt with. Can't tell you how many clients have been like, I'm like, hey, you open yet? Oh, no, man, we're waiting on Con Ed. It's terrible. When I was building out one of my coffee bars on the Upper East Side of Manhattan by the UN, well, Midtown East, I was ready to open. I was bringing power from the street, and I needed them to just run a line. And the guy came. I set a meeting for myself. This was in the late 90s or early 2000s. I had a meeting. They were supposed to come. They came, they surveyed it. They were supposed to start on Tuesday. They didn't. Wednesday, the supervisor comes by. Oh yeah, no, sorry about the delay. I'll make sure it gets done. Nothing happens. He comes by, I'm calling, he comes by next week. Oh yeah, I'm sorry, nothing gets done. And I'm like, what is happening here? I speak to one of my partners. I speak to some other friends in the industry, and they're like, dummy, this guy is waiting for something for you. Now, this doesn't happen anymore. And I'm not saying that anything happened other than somebody may have slipped this guy an envelope with something in it that made him more apt to get the job done. And funny enough, after he got that envelope, he was there the next day. And I got my power, and I was making coffee in a couple of days. Life is not like that in the city anymore. So you gotta really understand that Con Ed is a huge potential hang up. Moving on. Let's talk about the cons of buying and the problems with buying. One of the cons of buying is that you are stuck with certain design flaws. It's not your dream space that you're buying. Kitchen designs can be funky. A lot of weird spatial issues might exist. And I've seen a lot of people overlook it to the point of when they open, they're regretful. So it has to work. Don't try to shove it in if it's not going to fit. You have an idea for something that calls for, I don't know, a brick oven, and you can't put a brick oven in, don't take the space. Find another space. You got to do what you want to do. The other con of buying is there's a reason why this place didn't work for the last person. What happened? How do we find out? Well, obviously, we're going to ask the owner, and they're going to tell you whatever the heck they want to tell you to have you buy the space. Oh, I had 3 other spaces and I just didn't have the time. That's my favorite one. That's bullshit. That's not a reason. Ask to see the books. Ask to see a P&L. Even though you're not buying the concept, even though you're going to change it from a Middle Eastern restaurant to an Italian restaurant, you need to have an idea of what the baseline is for the revenue. Are you doing $2 million a year out of the space? Or are you doing 5? If I need to do 5 and you're doing 2, I'm going to take a closer look and see what's going on. Maybe I'll spend more time there, see what the foot traffic's like, talk to some neighbors, see how they're doing. But you can't expect that you're going to just double the revenue. It doesn't really work like that. So be very careful. Another con of buying is that you're really taking the space as is. You might miss some latent defects, and you might end up spending more money than you thought. You can't open every single wall. And we've had 1 million clients go in there and buy a place, and everything was hunky-dory, and the GC said, no sweat, we got you. And then they open up a wall to move something like, ooh, oh boy, we did not expect to see this, whatever the hell it is. That's going to cost you. So be careful. Open up as much as you can. Don't skimp on the pre-opening, negotiation inspection. It is the key to everything when you're buying a space. Okay. That was a lot of talking, but I'm still going to continue because it's my solo show. So there we are, deciding the cons of buying. Let's talk about the next slide, please, which is deciding to sell. Anybody have any questions? If you have any questions, I can use them. You just need a second. Okay, no problem. Here we go. Deciding to sell. If you have a space that you want to offload, and we all have our reasons, the first thing you need to do is talk to your landlord and understand what you've got going on in your lease. Because whoever you sell it to is not going to be happy with the term left on your lease. They're going to want to extend it. And they're going to want to extend it at a reasonable rent. So before you decide to sell, take a look at your assignment clause, understand if it's going to be problematic. We're going to look at that. And then look to see if your rent is about or below market. If it's not, for example, if you're paying $40,000 for a 1,500 square foot space because you bought it at the height of the market, well, we're going to have an issue because no one's going to want to take over the lease with an astronomical rent. It's just not going to happen. So you have to ask yourself at the very beginning, what is my relationship with my landlord? This is the key to the sale. And if it's a good relationship, then you're more apt to be able to sell it without a problem. If you have a contentious relationship with your landlord, watch out. Watch out. So you want to find out what the current market value is, and then you want to decide if you can risk waiting for the sales process to close. You have to understand how much, first of all, you can get for the space. So call a broker, say, I've got this space. What would you list it at? And they'll say, well, I probably listed it at 200. You should understand if they want to list it at 200, it's going to sell for less. And so be realistic about that. Maybe it'll sell for 150. Really depends on how much interest you get. We just sold a place in Prospect Heights that had some good interest, and we had a little bit of a bidding war. And that was really beneficial to the seller. That was a great situation. We closed it quickly. Buyer was happy, seller was happy. It happens. But you have to understand what the range is if you're going to make a decision to sell. And then you've looked at your lease. You think, okay, it's potentially okay. I think the landlord's going to agree to whatever I need them to agree to. I think it's a sale price I can deal with. Well, then you got to think about your employees and how are you going to do it? Are you going to remain open? You can expect that the minute you go to a broker and say that you're interested in selling, that it's going to be out there. Our industry is an industry of talkers and minglers and gossip, and everybody talks. So you better be ready to have an employee come back to you and say, hey, I heard this thing's up for sale. You got to be careful about that. Sometimes you can quietly tell some friends in the industry. It's still going to get out. So be very, very careful about that. And then the final decision as to whether or not you should sell really comes down to, again, money. And the question of, are you better off sending in your notice to the landlord to trigger your personal guarantee good guy release? Or do you want to stay open or stay closed and spend money on the rent until it sells? And so how long does it take to sell? It takes time. It could take 3 months. It could take 6 months. It could take longer. So you have to make a calculation about what you can afford out of pocket while you're trying to sell. If you're up and running and you're breaking even, okay, you're good. If you're losing money, maybe not so good. If you're closed, maybe not good at all, because now we have to keep paying rent. We have nothing coming in. So the earlier that you decide to sell, the earlier you decide, the better. And that's the truth. The earlier, the better. Okay. Next slide. Here are some pros of selling your restaurant. Number one, You get to recoup some of the money on the way out. What are you going to recoup? Well, let's do the math. Well, let's at least talk about the formula. You're going to get the purchase price. Let's call it, I don't know, $150,000. And then you have to deduct some things like the broker commission. If you use a broker, they're going to take up to 30%. A good broker is taking 30%. So take that off the top. Oh yeah, then there's lawyers. That could be another $20,000 by the time you're done. 15,000, 20,000, something like that. Take that off the top. Then you've got some landlord fees potentially. You got to look into your lease and see what the deal is. We just sold a small cafe business. It was 2 businesses. And we didn't do the original lease, but in the original lease, there was a provision that if this company sold 2 stores or less as part of a sale, that the landlord gets 50% of the sale price, 50%. If they would have sold 3, the landlord would get nothing. Crazy. We tried every which way to get out of this. We were so upset about it. We were yelling at the landlord and their attorney. They held their ground. And in the end, they were right. It was in the lease. These guys weren't selling 3, they were selling 2, and they ended up spending a couple of $100,000 to give to the landlord for nothing. So be careful. Anyway, you're going to get to recoup some money. You're going to get to pay back some of your debt. Anything that you have that has a personal guarantee, we call it a PG, you better put onto a ledger and understand. This could be loans from the SBA. This could be certainly your lease. You're going to have a personal guarantee. Your vendor contracts oftentimes come with a personal guarantee. So you got to take a look at that and make sure you don't, at least you understand what it is that you owe. This will help you decide if it's worth selling or not. The other pro of selling is you get Landy out of your life because it's a clean exit from the lease and the personal guarantee. You get to leave, you get to make some money. Landlord is off your ass and you can start the next thing. It's not so easy to get out of a personal guarantee. Yes, you can give notice, and yes, we try to make it as easy as possible, but you know who landlords are. They're always giving our clients a hard time when they try to get out. Oh, well, you owe us this water bill from 2 years ago. Oh, you need to fix this. We just had a client sell a business in Manhattan, and the lease said that it had to be delivered back to the landlord the same way the landlord gave it to him. Well, our client moved the kitchen. They moved the kitchen from one floor to the next. Landlord said, sure, no problem at the time. When we sent them in the notice to get out of the lease, they said, yeah, sure, no problem, but you're going to have to move that kitchen back. Move the kitchen back. You know how much that costs? A lot. It costs a lot. And so it's never easy to get out of a PG. When you sell, typically the person's taking it as is. You don't have to worry about any of that crap. What you will get back to on the plus side of selling is your security deposit. So oftentimes we're, 2 to 6 months of security deposit in deep with the landlord. And what happens in these deals, the way we structure them, is that the landlord keeps the security deposit, but the buyer reimburses you because now it's their money in security. So if you got 30, 40,000 bucks sitting in a security deposit account, you get that back and the buyer pays it to you. So that's nice. We love that. So there's some money to be made when you sell. Great. Any questions so far? Okay. let's talk about the seller and your new BFF, the landlord. All I can tell you is this. You need the landlord to make this deal. The landlord is the key to the whole thing, because without a new lease that's going to work for the buyer, and without a landlord not giving you a hard time as the seller, it's not going to happen. And now we all know, through all of these different webinars and through our experiences with landlords, that there's nothing more dangerous in this world than a landlord with leverage. And guess what? They've got it. Now they've got it. They know that you need them. So you better be nice. The first thing you're going to want to do is review the assignment clause. You have to take your lease, go to your lawyer, first look at it yourself, you're smart enough, review your assignment clause and see what it says. We're looking for some magic terms. The most magical is consent to be not unreasonably withheld. What does that mean? It means the landlord will not unreasonably withhold their consent to an assignment. Those are good words. We like to see that. If it doesn't say those words, you're going to have to jump through some hoops. The other things you want to look for are what kind of a buyer you need. Does it say that the buyer has to have a net worth of $5 million? Does it say that to assign the lease, a buyer needs to have some experience in the hospitality industry? Sometimes they say these things. So you need to know what it says. So when you go out to market, you can screen the buyer and make sure that they're qualified. It's essential. Once you do that, and once you look at your assignment clause, you're going to want to call the landlord and find out if she's open to a buyer modifying, extending, or negotiating a new lease. We talked about those terms before, but here's the minimum. No one's taken a lease for less than 10 years. Your original lease was probably for 10. Now you're in year 6, you've got 4 left. You're going to need to extend it to 10. Hi, landlord, I'm thinking about selling my space. Okay, I need it extended to 10 years. Are you willing to do that? Sure. Are you willing to keep it at the same rent with the same 3% escalation every year? Well, we'll talk about that. That's where you're going to get hung up every time. They're fine with going to 10, and sometimes they're not. I have a client in Funky Town, Brooklyn, a weird space in a weird in-between neighborhood. And he has somebody who's interested in buying his space. We went to the landlord and said, hey, we need a 10-year lease. The landlord said, nah, I don't give more than 5. I don't give more than, who doesn't give more than 5? That's how I do it. You don't like it, too bad. So what happened? We can't sell the space. No one's going to take it at 5 years. It's insane. Why would you? So other things to look at and understand, you want to make sure that, for example, there's no demo clause. These are deal breakers for any buyer that comes in. A demo clause is just a clause that says the landlord can take the space back if they want to demolish it. Maybe they pay you, maybe they don't. And another hang up that buyers oftentimes are concerned about is the notice period on the personal guarantee. If you've got a 6-month notice period, 180 days, you might have a buyer who's not comfortable with that. Whatever you do, though, when after the buyer gets to look at the lease, make sure you put their specific requests into the LOI. You don't want to sign an LOI where the buyer just gets to say, yeah, no, I just need a lease to be the way I want it. As a buyer, you like that, but as a seller, you don't. As a seller, you want to say, tell me what you need to change, and that's when we're closing, because you need to agree to it, because you know your landlord and you know what they'll be willing to give on and not. Okay, Great. That's the seller and your new BFF. Moving on to the next slide. The buyer and the landlord. Well, we just talked about the seller and the landlord. So now you're buying a place. And first thing you need to do is you need to take a look at the lease. And you want that lease in your hand the minute you decide that you want to buy the space, because as we know, it's all about the lease. And so you want to review this thing, you want to see what terms need to be modified, and you want to start talking to the buyer about it. The buyer's not the seller about it, sorry. The seller is not going to allow you to simply call the landlord and start talking to them. No chance. We're going to sign an LOI first, then we're going to give you the lease. Then you're going to look at it, or we'll give you the lease as we're negotiating an LOI so we can put the terms in there. But we're not going to introduce you to the landlord until that LOI is signed. You don't get to talk to them. We need to know what you're going to talk about. We need to be part of the conversation. We need to know that you're not going to screw up anything, buyer. Because remember, I'm the seller, I'm the one with the relationship, and I can't have you just shooting your mouth off to the landlord. It could hurt us. The other thing I'm going to say, and this is absolutely key to everything, there are 3 sets of people involved in this. You have the landlord and their lawyer, you have the buyer and their lawyer, and you have the seller and their lawyer. It's difficult and expensive enough when there's 2 lawyers involved. Now you've thrown in a 3rd lawyer. So it gets confusing, it can get long, it can get expensive. You, as the seller, need to be the quarterback. You cannot hand this deal off. You have to make sure that everyone's talking to everyone. If you have a good lawyer, they'll take on a lot of that. But ultimately, you're talking to the people. You're talking to the person who wants to buy it. You're talking to the landlord. You're talking to people. The more involved our clients are in the sale and every aspect of it, the more likely it is to close quickly and without a problem. So it's a big job. So think about that when you're thinking about buying and selling, especially when you're thinking about selling, how much time it's going to take, because it's going to take a lot of time. The buyer is going to want to make sure they've got their 10 years. They're going to want to make sure to look to see every dollar that the landlord is going to try to extract from them. And they try to extract them in different ways, through escalations, through taxes, through water bills. So you are scrubbing this lease to see what it's going to cost you to live there, to have your business there. You also want to see what kind of default provisions are in the lease. How hard is the landlord going to be to live with? Are they going to send me default notices for every ticky-tack thing that I do? Are they going to be up in my grill for every little default and sending me notices? You want to know. You also probably, if you have a good lawyer, want to take a look and see how many lawsuits this landlord has been involved in. Are they litigious? Talk to some of their people. Talk to some of their tenants. You know, they get to figure out who you are and ask you all this information about your finances and your credit history, and they ask for references. Well, you should do the same for them. They're going to be an important person in your life, and you better make sure that they're not difficult. As a buyer, an LOI tip is that the deal closes upon a new lease to your satisfaction. If you can get that into an LOI, great. What does that mean? It means that you've agreed on a purchase price, and that when you go to closing, the only way you're going to close is if you end up with a lease that's to your liking. So we're always trying for that. Okay. Moving on. Buyer due diligence. You know, there is a lot of things to do when you're buying a place. The first thing to do is to do a tax and lien search. Your lawyer will do that for you. What that does, it lets us know if the seller has any sales tax owed or any other taxes, or if there are any liens on the equipment. Oftentimes when we do a lien search, we will find that there are some liens on the equipment. Maybe it's a bank, maybe it's from a loan agreement. And guess what? The seller's going to have to clear that up before you buy the business, because the last thing you want is someone knocking on your door asking you for money for a business that you didn't run. So a tax and lien search is essential. Sales tax is essential. Making sure that there's nothing outstanding. You also want to know what all their debts are. Well, why do you care? Well, you might decide to use the same vendors that these guys used. And if you've ever talked to a vendor who's owed a bunch of money from the previous guy, they tend to get a little skittish. They're not just so willing to forget what was owed to them. So you want to know what you're getting into. You want to know if there are SBA loans, especially after COVID, because those have to oftentimes be satisfied before you close. And you want to know, obviously, if there's any rent arrears, because that's also going to come out of the purchase price at closing. So we got to have a good picture of what it is you're buying. We always scrub the space for SLA stipulations, community board stipulations, early closing times, hours for outside, et cetera, music. And we also want to know if there's a negative history within the space. If they were issued 5 violations in the last 6 months, guess what? Your community board experience is going to be unpleasurable. It's just not going to be fun. So you got to know what you're getting into. And you also want to know if there are some pending lawsuits. Great. Let's see. Well, this is the last slide. This is great. And we have some questions. Let's talk about the life cycle. So you understand, now that we've talked about all the different things that kind of are involved in selling your business, and it's a lot. Let me see if I can put it together for you in a life cycle so you understand how it works. I'm thinking about selling my business. First thing I'm going to do is a financial analysis. I want to decide if I'm going to sell it or if I'm just going to send in my notice to the landlord. That's the biggest decision. If you think that you can stick it out and that it's going to be worth it and that you can make enough money between the purchase price and the return of your security deposit, and your investors are going to be happier with it, well, maybe it's a good idea to sell it. But once you make that decision to sell, your very next call is to your landlord. And you are so nice to your landlord, like you can't even believe that you can be this nice to someone like your landlord. And you call up your landlord and you tell them the truth. Hey, it's not working. I want to find you a tenant. Would you be willing to allow me to assign the lease? And if so, can you tell me what kind of terms you'd be willing to accept? This is the key conversation. Again, if you can't get the landlord to 10 years and you can't get the landlord to a rent that's going to work, don't sell it. You're not going to be able to. Might as well just hang it up. So now you've contacted the landlord. Landlord says, yeah, I'll give you 10 years. I'll give you a fair market value. No sweat. Not going to give you a hard time. Yippee. Yay, I get to sell my business. I'm going to call some brokers right away. Or I'm going to reach out to some friends. One of the two. And I'm going to get a price. I'm going to start to think about how I want to set the price of my restaurant. Once that happens, let's call it $200,000. Then we're putting it on the market and we're showing it. Another choice, quietly or blast. I've had clients who have sold these deals through other people they know in the business and haven't had to pay a commission. I've had other clients who have put it on Instagram. I'm selling my restaurant, I'm closing. Anyone interested, let me know. And they get 100 responses from qualified buyers. So there's a couple of different ways to do it. But once you put it on the market, then you're negotiating with the buyer. Buyers coming in, they're bringing in their GC, they're looking around, they're talking to people in the neighborhood. They come back to you and they say, I know you're asking 200, but I want to pay you 180. Okay, you say 180 is fine. I'll take 180. I mean, it never goes that easy, but let's just pretend. So it's $180,000. Awesome. Let's call the lawyers and have them negotiate an LOI. Let's put this on paper. And here are all the things we want to talk about. And let's do that. Okay, great. That takes a couple of weeks. LOI is done. You sign the LOI. All right, now we're getting somewhere. Once the LOI is signed, you've agreed to the basic terms, then as the seller, you can introduce the buyer to the landlord. The buyer has already looked at the lease, but now we have to make sure that they can actually get what they want. So the buyer's attorney talks to the seller's attorney, buyer's attorney talks to the landlord's attorney. The seller's attorney is also involved in the conversation to protect the seller, make sure everything's cool. And while we're doing that, the seller is drafting the APA. It's just taking the terms of the term sheet or the LOI, and they're just putting them into a full-blown contract. Once that's done, it's signed. Both parties sign it. Now you are in contract. Major, major moment. The buyer gives the seller a 10% deposit. The attorney takes that 10% deposit. They put it in their escrow account. Now we're just waiting for a couple more things to happen, and then we get to closing. The first thing we want to do is go to the community board. It's going to say in our agreement that this deal closes upon two things: community board approval for a transfer for the hours that we have already told you we want, and a lease that works for us. So yay, we go in from the community board. They say yes to everything. Got Joseph Levy and Heather up there. They're kicking ass. Everyone's doing great. Yes, no problem. We love you. You're in. Check that off the list. Now there's one thing left to get to closing, and that is the lease. Are we ready? Have we agreed with the landlord? Are they giving us a hard time or are they not? At some point, they're going to say, okay, here it is. Here's your lease extension. Here's your modification. We're ready to sign. Once that happens, you get the community board approval, get the lease done, you go to closing. Get the money from the buyer. You take some of that money, maybe you're paying the landlord, you're paying the seller's paying off some people that they owe, and you're done. And you've sold your restaurant. And now you can move on and open up another one because we're all that crazy. That, my friends, in 56 minutes is how to deal with an APA. And we've got a bunch of questions. I'm going to try to answer them. And I will not use anyone's name, don't worry. Here's a question. What if someone has a thriving institution with 12 years left on the lease? How would you advise selling that restaurant, keeping in mind that it's a multi-million-dollar sale price, way different than the usual 50 to 500K sale price, essentially eliminating most people? One might think a big restaurant group is the answer, but they will most likely not go over a certain amount because they usually think we can just create our own concept from scratch. It's a lucky problem, but still a real one. Well, if you have 12 years left on a lease and you think it's a multi-million-dollar sale, my question would be based on what? I mean, it's not a multi-million-dollar sale based on just a good lease. this is a place that would have to be actually making money and making a significant amount of money, because anybody who invests in your space is going to want to recoup their money quickly. So if they want to buy what you're selling and they want to keep it that way, that's a whole different ballgame. And that's something we can talk about later. What I'm talking about today are just selling the bones. And I've never seen the bones sell for multi-millions of dollars. Another question. If you're looking to sell, what is your suggested strategy and what to do with the equipment and inventory? Well, if you have equipment, you're going to want to see if the buyer wants it. Most of the time they will. And so if the buyer wants the equipment, great, we'll give the buyer the equipment. If they don't want it, you can take it and scrap it. I mean, you get 5 cents on the dollar for what you paid for it. So sometimes it's more of a hassle to get rid of it than it is to just try to pawn it off on the person who's coming in to buy the place. Your inventory you can sell also. Usually it's part of the purchase price, but if you've got, for example, a huge wine collection and you want to charge extra for that, then you should. And it should be part of the sale price, and it can be an option for the buyer. You can either sell it directly to the buyer or you can sell it to somebody else. It's really up to you. Anybody else have any questions? We are 2 minutes before 12 o'clock. I'm here. I'm willing to answer any crazy question you have about buying and selling restaurants. So if you have any, now's the time to do it. I am shocked that we got through that in an hour. That was me on, that was me speed talking. But here we go. Here's another question. A couple of questions coming in. What if someone is hoping to sell a partial, almost complete space that isn't open yet? How does that change the equation if it does? And are there additional factors that should be considered? Well, if you're selling an almost complete space, I would be interested to know what happened. Why are you bailing? And if it's all going to really come down to how nice the build out is, meaning, do you know what you're doing and is it going to work for somebody? And what your lease is like, because if you're still in build out, you probably have 10 years left or so. So it really depends on the specifics. I've seen it happen, and you always can get more money at the beginning of a build out. The equipment, if you have any there, is new. The build out is new. The HVAC is new. So you can absolutely charge more for it. It's a good question. Any thoughts? Now the questions are coming in. Good. Thank you. Any thoughts on the pros and cons of going public with your intent to sell and potentially spooking your vendors and partners? Well, let's talk about the partners first. You got to tell them. Oftentimes in your operating agreement, you have to tell them. You have to get consent to sell your business. So that's number one. Your vendors, I mean, they've been around the block. They may get spooked in the sense that you owe them a lot of money. And if that's what you're talking about, and they may say, well, hey, we're going to COD. So that could happen. That could absolutely happen. Always try to keep it quiet first. See if you know anybody. You've got friends in the industry. Start putting it out there that way. Another question. Any advice for first-time buyers trying to open their first space on navigating the many steps of this process? Yeah, take your time. Raise your money first. Go look at spaces and educate yourself, and then hire a lawyer who knows what they're doing so they can take you through the process and they can save you money. We have a program called the concierge program at our firm. First timers only get a discounted hourly rate, and they get to work with me and a team that I put together because I've done so many of these. The idea is that we want to take you through and educate you as a first timer as to what we're actually doing here. So that's my advice to you. A lot more questions coming in. Is there an extension on the lease? Is that considered, if there is an extension on the lease, is that considered a long lease? 6 years left plus 10-year extension, 85% market value. Absolutely. That is considered a long lease, depending on what the extension terms are. Sometimes an extension term says that the tenant has the right to extend. All they got to do is send a note to the landlord. I want to extend. Cool, you're in, no problem. Sometimes it's the landlord's option, and sometimes the landlord and tenant both have to agree. That is not considered a long lease. If the landlord has any right to say no, no buyer is going to accept that. So we have to make sure we have the absolute right to do it. Another good question. What was the term when someone changes the term of the LOI, please? Oh, well, that term is called retrading. Retrading, it's a term that's used in the real estate world all the time. Yes, landlord, I'll pay you $20,000 a month rent at a 4% increase, la, 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 la. And then we get into a lease and then we say, you know what? We don't want to do 4%, we want to do 2%. And the landlord will look at you and they'll say, you signed an LOI with us. Now you're retrading. Either stop asking for that or we're going to stop negotiating with you. That's how serious retrading is taken in the real estate world. Many, many more questions coming in, folks. Thank you. I will stay here as long as I need to answer them. Can you talk about a range of valuation for a profitable restaurant? Say your restaurant has tax returns showing profits in the 5 to 10% range. Would the sale price be a multiple of cash flow or sales? What's the rule of thumb? We're talking about key money deals here. So there is no rule of thumb. Most people who are coming in to buy your restaurant don't really care what numbers you're doing because they're not going to be running the same business. Now, some people may be interested, and if they are, and you want to sell your business as an ongoing business, you own David's Cafe and you want to keep it David's Cafe, or the buyer does, look to see how much you're asking and look to see if the buyer can make their money back in 2 to 3 years. That's what we look at. I'm not going to give you $500,000 for David's Cafe if you're making $50,000 a year, because it's going to take me 5 years to make my money back, or 10 years, sorry, whatever the number is. So that really depends. What's the best strategy in dealing with your employees? When do you tell them? Should you try to get the buyer to take employees? No, I just had a situation where the seller did just that. And part of the deal was that the buyer had to take the employees. When the employees found out what was happening, they revolted and they said, we don't like the new owner. We don't like their tip policy. We don't like X, Y, and Z. And it became a whole big mess. When you're done, you're done. Don't make them try to take the employees. When should you tell your employees? You should tell them as early as possible and as late as possible. Tell them as late as possible, because if you're open, you don't want them leaving. If I'm a bartender and I know my time is up and I had a couple of other offers, I'm going to bounce. I'm out. So you got to be careful about that. But you also want to tell them early enough so that they have an opportunity to find work. If you have a good relationship with your employees, you'll be able to figure out what the sweet spot is. Another question. You keep putting $200,000 as an example for key money. Is it often the average, or how do you factor the value? Well, I'm using 200 because it is aspirational. Most restaurants, and when I'm talking about most restaurants, I'm talking about your typical 1,500 square footer, 60, 70 seat kind of thing, neighborhood restaurant. The big ones can go for a lot more. And we see those trading these days from anywhere from 100 to 200. That's just where they're trading, but that changes depending on the market conditions. So that's why it's important to talk to a broker and talk to your lawyers who are in the hospitality business to understand how much the market's willing to pay for your specific place. If you have a place, let's just say on the Lower East Side in Community Board 3, and you have a 4 a.m. liquor license, value is going up because you might be able to transfer that. So there's a lot of little factors that come into play, but that's another great question. Okay, folks, thank you all for coming. I really enjoyed this. I loved your questions. And I'm around. You can always email me at david@helbraunlevey.com. We have a lot more webinars coming to you over the next couple of months. And we're going to continue doing these until we have covered every topic, which will only take us 30 to 40 more years. So thank you all for coming. Enjoy this beautiful day, and I'll see you all soon.